Thank you, John. Actually, it just occurred to me sitting up there that my colleagues sitting back there will have a hard time seeing the slides.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether that's going to be, whether you could possibly, you may not be able to see them there. I'm showing lots of slides, so it's kind of important to be able to see them. So if you'd like to maybe move somewhere where you can see the slides better. That was just occurred to me as I was sitting back there. Okay, well, good evening. And yes, that's right. Let's have the lights down as low as possible so people can see the slides clearly. Yes, can you hear me all right? That's right. Let me know if there's any auditory problem about hearing me. Just let me know. Call out and don't be shy and let me know. Thank you. Well, with the first slide here, as you can see, this photo shows the Marin Civic Center after the first section, the administration building, was completed in 1963, what we're celebrating here tonight, the 50th anniversary. But before, construction began on the second section. And here we see the interior, also a photograph of 1963. Yeah, again, it would be nice if really the ceiling lights could all be turned off. I don't know whether that's possible. Is that all right with everyone? Yeah, okay. And here, the whole structure after the completion of the Hall of Justice in 1969. I was asked to talk this evening not about the Civic Center itself, but about what else was happening in American architecture during that period when this complex was being planned, to get a sense of how Frank Lloyd Wright's design fit into its architectural context or was different from it. So we're talking about the 1950s and early 60s, essentially the post-World War II period, a time of increasing prosperity in the United States and therefore of growth and lots of construction and generally a spirit of optimism. All of this was recognized at the time by architects and historians and critics, and a lot was written about what soon came to be called mid-century modernism in architecture. In preparing my remarks, I looked again at several of the books on this subject that came out at that time, and I'll make some observations about the architecture of this period, especially some of the buildings that received the most attention. Now, it's often assumed that Frank Lloyd Wright's work throughout his career was so unprecedented or ahead of its time that it stood alone and had no parallels. We also tend to think of the mid-century period as being almost completely dominated by the international style, which we know that Wright disliked, to put it mildly. But I'm going to try to suggest that the story is a bit more complicated than this. Now, it is true that a large number of the buildings of this mid-century period did fit clearly into the international style framework, and let's see some examples. Here we see the Seagram Building in New York, built in 1958 by Mies van der Rohe, who had come to the U.S. just before the Second World War and built a number of prominent buildings. Two more examples. This Farnsworth House in Illinois of about 1950, and Crown Hall at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. Mies's version of the international style was adopted by many American architects and firms, such as SOM, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Here's their Lever Building in New York of 1952. And I should also mention Richard Neutra, another European architect who had come to the U.S. earlier than Mies and developed his own version of the international style. Here we see his Kaufman House in Palm Springs of 1946. The same Kaufman family, by the way, that had earlier built Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water in Pennsylvania. The international style tended to be favored especially by large firms and the leaders of the architectural profession. And this can be seen in a publication produced in 1961 by the American Institute of Architects, the AIA. devoted to the buildings that had received its honor awards over the last 12 years. More than 200 buildings of all types, commercial, residential, government buildings, and so forth, and the great majority of them could be called international style in one way or another. Here we see a typical sample of the commercial buildings in the book, which happens to include the Crown Zellerbach building in San Francisco, 1959, up in the upper right there. And here, a group of hospital buildings from this book. By the way, not one of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings had received an AIA award during this period. They had given him a gold medal in 1949 for his lifetime achievements. They apparently realized that they had to do something to recognize the most famous American architect. But the AIA tended to think of Wright as too individualistic or eccentric or unprofessional in certain ways. And Wright made no secret of his contempt for the AIA. He never joined the organization, and in one interview he called it, quote, a harbor of refuge for the incompetent. Now, actually, this was not quite correct. The typical AIA members were largely competent. It was more imaginative qualities that they probably tended to lack. But it was a typical remark, of course, of Frank Lloyd Wright. In any case, these AIA awards didn't give the full picture of what was happening in American architecture at this time. Another overview had been given several years earlier in an exhibition and book produced by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1952, built in USA post-war architecture. And here, Wright was not only included, but one of his recent buildings was featured as the book's frontispiece, as you can see here, the Laboratory Tower addition of 1949 to his Johnson Wax Company buildings in Racine, Wisconsin. This attention to Wright by the MoMA was a bit surprising because the Museum of Modern Art was strongly associated with the international style. And Philip Johnson, the curator of its architecture and design department, was one of the most vocal proponents of the international style. Johnson wrote the preface to this book, and in it he spoke about the crucial importance of the international style to modern architecture. And he said, quote, every building in this book would look different if it had not been for the international style. So, Johnson was implying that even Wright had been influenced by the international style. Wright, of course, would have disagreed vehemently. According to him, if there was any influence, it was all the other way around. Personally, I think that some of Wright's later works do reveal some influence from the international style. And the Johnson Tower is an example of this. But that's really another topic that I can't really get into here. Well, several other recent buildings by Wright were also featured in this MoMA exhibition and book, such as his second Jacobs House in Wisconsin and the V.C. Morris store here in San Francisco. Wright's little masterpiece just off of Union Square, whose interior can be seen as a kind of tryout for the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which Wright had been working on, but whose execution kept getting put off until the late 1950s. So he was really playing around with this idea in his creation of the V.C. Morris store. Still, many of the buildings in this MoMA exhibition were the familiar international style works. The buildings of Mies and SOM and Neutra and Walter Gropius, here his Harvard Graduate Center of about 1950, and the United Nations buildings in New York of the same time, mainly the work of Harrison and Abramovitz, and one of the best-known contemporary houses in America was included, Philip Johnson's own glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut, also of about 1950. This was perhaps the purest distillation of Mies van der Rohe's ideal of minimalism, less is more. And needless to say, Wright was not impressed by it. The story is that when the house was completed, Johnson invited Wright to visit. And when they got there and went in, Wright said, "Well, Philip, do I take my hat off or leave it on?" To Wright, this hardly even qualified as architecture or enclosure. He might as well have been outdoors. Well, the MoMA exhibition also included buildings that represented variations on the international style, such as the Maimonides Health Center here in San Francisco by Erich Mendelsohn of 1952, which actually harked back to designs made by Mendelsohn many years earlier in Germany. And there were even a few buildings that were very different in character, such as a house in Arizona by Schweiker and Elting, apparently inspired by Wright's Taliesin West. And another house in Arizona by Paolo Soleri and Mark Mills, both of whom had been apprentices of Wright and had picked up his fascination with unconventional geometric forms. Well, the dome here may suggest the geodesic structures of Buckminster Fuller, even though it's not strictly speaking a geodesic dome. And in fact, there began to be a renewal of interest at this time in Fuller's structural innovations, as some of his concepts began to be executed following the Second World War. Here, one of his geodesic domes under construction in Louisiana at that time. And there were other similarly unconventional designers who were receiving some attention at this time, such as Bruce Gough, another former Wright apprentice. Here's his Ballinger House in Oklahoma, built in 1955. Or John Johansson, here a design and a model, never constructed, for what he called the Airform House, to be made by spraying concrete over an armature of steel tubes and wire mesh. This design and a couple of the works of Fuller and Gough were illustrated in a book that came out in 1959, Architecture USA by Ian McCollum. And the Airform House was even shown on the book's cover, as you can see. But these sorts of designs were considered really fringe and generally weren't taken very seriously. And nearly everything in McCollum's book was much more conventional and mainstream. But still, there were some important departures by this time, even in the work of successful mainstream architects. And one example is Edward Durell Stone. Stone's early work had been fully international style in nature, but by now he was exploring something rather different, often covering his buildings with pierced screens of one sort or another, as we see here in the Stanford Medical School buildings of the mid-1950s. Or the U.S. Embassy building in New Delhi, India. This is a model of the building. It was built. Well, traditional modernists tended to criticize Stone's buildings as merely decorative or superficial. And Frank Lloyd Wright didn't like them much either. He called this Indian embassy building the Taj Maria. Maria was Edward Stone's wife's name. Wright, as we know, could be a little nasty when he wanted to be. But there was some irony here, because one of the sources of Stone's pierced screens probably came from Wright's own work. his textile block designs, as he called them, which he'd been experimenting with since the 1920s. Here we see one example of this is Anna's house in Los Angeles of that time. Also, many modernist architects criticized some of Wright's work as being merely decorative. In any case, more significant in the long run than Edward Durell Stone was another architect who became prominent during this period, Louis Kahn, who developed a distinctive system of design which first appeared fully in the late 1950s in the Richards Medical Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Kahn analyzed each architectural program into its functional parts and let this shape the design. And in this way, his approach was somewhat similar to Wright's, in contrast, say, to the international style, which tended to favor one system for all building types. For this medical research building, Kahn structured the design around what he called served and servant spaces, the servant spaces being for things like circulation and the extensive mechanical equipment needed for a building like this. Kahn followed this up with another research building, the Salk Center in La Jolla, of about 1960, where the design not only followed this rational analysis of the program, but also was strikingly beautiful. Most people agreed in its organization of forms and their relationship to the site, a high bluff overlooking the Pacific. Here we see another view of this Salk Center. But the architect who probably attracted the most attention in the late 50s was Eero Saarinen. He, too, had begun as a faithful modernist, but then, over a tragically brief career, he died young in 1961, he produced an amazing body of works, which often resulted from innovative structural forms. Here we see his Kresge Auditorium at MIT, utilizing a thin shell concrete dome supported on only 3 small points. But just as interesting, Saarinen used a completely different type of form for the other part of his MIT commission, a small chapel, which he enclosed in a cylindrical brick structure, producing a striking contrast with the auditorium. They're on the same field at MIT, so you see them together. Then, in quick succession, Saarinen produced more explorations of unusual structural forms. A hockey rink at Yale University, the TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport in New York. And here we see another view of it. And the interior. The Gateway Arch in St. Louis. And then the Dulles Airport terminal in Washington. A word that was sometimes used to describe Saarinen's designs and those of some other architects of the period was formalist, that is, suggesting a fascination with differing and unusual forms. And in this way, I think Saarinen's work is similar, actually, to Frank Lloyd Wright's, especially Wright's later designs, where there's also a fascination with unusual and striking forms. For example, in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, was finally built in the late 1950s. Or Temple Beth Shalom in a suburb of Philadelphia, also of the late 50s. And here we see the interior of this synagogue. Or the Unitarian Church in Madison, Wisconsin, of a little earlier. Not to mention, of course, the Marin Civic Center itself, where this emphasis on dramatic form is so strong. Here we see another photograph taken in 1963, just at the completion of the administration building. This, by the way, is one of a series of fine views of the Civic Center taken by the architectural photographer Ezra Stoller, who was Wright's favorite photographer for his buildings. Another innovative young architect of this period whose work began attracting attention was Paul Rudolph, especially in his art and architecture building at Yale, designed and constructed at the same time as the Marin Civic Center. This building shocked many architects and critics by its violation of a number of modernist principles. For example, it seemed unnecessarily complex, even perversely complex, both in its exterior form and its interior spaces. And in fact, Rudolph was probably inspired in part by Frank Lloyd Wright's love of spatial complexity. But there was something else that was considered odd in this building, a kind of humor or game playing, seen, for example, in Rudolph's incorporation of classical sculpture and other historical forms and details that had been banished by the modernists. And peculiar architectural jokes, like having classical columns framing a small auditorium, except that only the capitals of the columns are actually here, floating at the top of steel rods, a kind of foretaste of postmodernist humor. Also during this period, more attention began being given to regional styles of architecture, such as the Bay Area regionalism of Northern California, with architects whose work, while certainly not all the same, did tend to share some traits, such as informality and the use of natural materials. Here we see Foothill College in Los Altos Hills by Ernest Kump, built at just the same time as the Marin Civic Center, like so many of the buildings that we've seen. And a house in Berkeley by Warren Callister of about the same time, and part of a complex of buildings by William Worcester at Stanford, the Center for Advanced Study, and buildings at Sea Ranch, north of here, by Charles Moore and his firm, Moreland and Whitaker and Turnbull, of the early 1960s. Well, in this review of what was happening in American architecture during this period, I've tried to suggest that there was a great deal of variety, some of it very different from Wright's work, but some of it similar in one way or another, and that there was lots of innovation. Wright was not the only innovator. Yet, in the final analysis, Wright still stands out, in my opinion, for the imaginative power of his work, even at the very end of his amazingly long career. Indeed, what was probably most remarkable about the Marin Civic Center was that here, in his last major work, when he was over 90 years old, a design that had to be finished and then executed after his death by others, notably Aaron Green, that here, Wright still was able to come up with a powerful basic concept, a series of arches bridging the hills of this beautiful site, a concept which could hold its own with any of the other works of American architecture of this period. Thank you.